This episode of Cinema of Meaning is sponsored by NordVPN. Get 4 bonus months for free when you sign up at nordvpn.com/cinemaofmeaning. What's the significance of the protagonist being white? The guy who kind of saves the day and enacts justice being white. And does that muddy the waters a little bit? Or like the other question I would have is, even if he's white, this movie is definitely coming from like the gaze of an outsider coming into this community, instead of like putting the actual native characters as the protagonists of the story.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Taylor Sheridan's Wind River. Before we begin, Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original podcast, meaning that on Nebula you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free and a week early. And you'll also get access to monthly bonus episodes. We just did one on the Netflix show Beef, but you'll also find exclusive discussions on Fight Club, Babylon, All Quiet on the Western Front, and many, many more. Be sure to use our personal link in the show notes to get a $20 discount on a yearly subscription. I also want to shout out our Discord server, where we discuss movies with our listeners and we take the occasional suggestion. If you want to join our little community, the link for that is also in the show notes. Now, back to the show. Thomas, Wind River, we talked about this a while back, about covering this. I think you had it mistaken for a different movie that you didn't enjoy as much, or did it turn out to be this one anyways?
I was confusing parts of this movie, and I forget the name of it, but the last film, I think, from Jeremy Saulnier, which I really did not
like. Was
like.
it Hold the Dark?
Hold the Dark, yeah, that was the name of it.
Oh, yeah.
But when I rewatched this one, I was like, oh yeah, okay. I sorted it out in my mind. They're not even that similar. I think they both take place in places that are cold or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But my memory of this movie was very vague for some reason. I didn't remember a lot of the details. Even as it was playing out, I was like, I don't know what's about to happen. So I got to watch it. I got to watch it a first time for a second time. I remembered aspects of it, but I got all the major plot points felt new to me. So I don't know what was going on the first time I watched it. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it the second time.
Mm-hmm. I think I've seen it like 4 times now.
Oh wow!
Maybe
okay,
even
cool.
5.
Yeah.
I don't know why exactly, but I'm a big fan of this movie. Especially because it's written and directed by Taylor Sheridan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly.
It might be Sheridan. Sheridan. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
For those who don't know, he is the writer of Sicario, Hell or High Water, and Wind River. I think was the first. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's technically his debut feature, but I think it's his first, quote unquote proper movie that he's directed. And I think he's just been a fan of mine since all those movies basically. And so I was looking forward to what he would do as a director. And to me, he didn't disappoint at all. He disappointed me with the movie that came after this, Those Who Wish Me Dead, I think it was called. But Wind River, I think, is excellent. And I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail, but for me, I think it's so much more than just a murder mystery with some latent Western elements. I think it's very much a deliberate recontextualization of the Western myth in a way that I think tackles in a really interesting way the lingering wound that was inflicted by the conflict between Americans and Native Americans back in the day.
Right.
and the way that still left scars that at this point have affected everyone without resolving anything really. And the way I think that sort of cultural element is connected to the grief that is experienced by the loss of these characters. For context, the movie revolves around a young native woman who is raped and murdered, and Jeremy Renner, he's not on the case, he's not a detective or anything, but he is a hunter in that area, and he is friends with the father and the mother. He's basically friends with the family that lost their daughter, and there's this new sort of rookie FBI agent coming into the scene, played by Elizabeth Olsen, and she's kind of the fish out of water character. And initially she brings Jeremy Renner's character, Corey is his name in the movie, along just as a sort of guide. But you kind of start to suspect, or he literally states at some point that he has his own motive. He's going to catch that killer, and he's just going to eliminate him, basically.
Right.
But what I was going to say is, the thing about Jeremy Renner's character is that he was also married to a Native American woman, and they also had a daughter together that was also killed in a similar looking case years back. They're not connected, but it's just there's a shared sense of grief between the father of this Native American girl that was just killed at the beginning of the story, and the grief that is experienced by Corey, again, that's Jeremy Renner's character, so many years earlier. And to me, the way that was kind of woven into each other with this very solemn atmosphere, that kind of reminded me of the discussion we had earlier about the assassination of Jesse James. This kind of a movie that just instantly makes you feel melancholic, but almost in a kind of not pleasing is not the right word, but in a it's an interesting movie to just vibe with on some level, and it really draws you into the coldness, into the bleakness, but also I'm not sure how to describe it. It's a very effective movie, or a very moving movie for me on that transportive level, where it just really takes me into this place, takes me into this world, and then has me experience this story.
Yeah, it's it's brutal. It's very dark, but like you're describing, I don't know, the vibe feels different. The darkness is different than what you might expect if you were like, oh, this is a dark neo-Western, set in, is it Wyoming? Yeah, Wyoming. Which the Wind River Reservation is a real, it's a real reservation, a real place. But yeah, it's not maybe what you would expect if you described that, but it captures and updates a lot of interesting sort of Western tropes set into a different place. Like, there's a sequence that you could very easily imagine being like, this is the sequence where they ride horseback through the woods, but it's, snowmobiles cutting through deep snow and pine trees. And it has a very specific mood and atmosphere, but also like sense of place. This not many movies are set in Wyoming or shot, in this kind of location in the snow. So I think it also just has a very specific kind of locale that it manages to capture.
Yeah. And what do you think, like, more thematically? What were the things about this movie that resonated for you? With you?
I think you touched on a lot of it. I think it has, it's definitely the kind of front and center headline is the treatment of the Native American people that are portrayed in this film, and it's it's really thematically is mostly interested in not just the specific, it's very interested in the specific case that they're dealing with and kind of those specific issues. It kind of touches on that at the end where there's no ongoing documentation of Native American women who go missing. It's just like it's undocumented. So we have no idea how many. We keep track of those numbers in America for every other group of people, but it's just completely undocumented. So it's kind of this problem that some people are aware of, but it's one that you couldn't even know the extent of the problem because so little attention is paid to it. So it's dealing with that subject matter in this specific story directly, which, is linked to this larger real world problem, and it's kind of examining that. But it's also like touching on how that is this microcosm of this much larger dysfunction. And so it's looking at that. It's also really, I think, looking at kind of the relationship between justice or sort of law keeping, quote unquote, in a very practical, physical sense, in the sense of, in a natural sense, for lack of a better word. There's this link between like kind of the harshness of nature and sort of Jeremy Renner like not being interested in like the justice afforded by the law, but the justice that can just be dealt through, himself or through nature. So it's looking at kind of the relationship between those things, and that's really highlighted by sort of all the squabbling over land and who has jurisdiction and who's in charge and who's allowed to be there. All of those things are very, very kind of front and center here.
Yeah. And what did you think this one thing that I was interested in, especially as someone who is not American and who kind of looks at this whole history, back in the day when I was a child, I used to play with these Playmobil cowboys and Indians, which to me at the time, they were both like equally exotic and equally mythical, I guess. Because I'm not an American, I don't really have any other association with either one of those figures, as they are, kind of
existed
become a
in
thing
history,
in history and in kind of the mythology around them. So, but I'm guessing for many Americans, this is a much more touchy subject because they, in some way or another, are more directly connected to this history. And I was especially curious, like, what did you think of the Jeremy Renner character as this white, I'm not sure if he's technically a white savior, but he's at the very least, I think, a white ally in this story.
Yeah.
Which I think there's reasons to do that, reasons not to do that. I'm just curious if you had any general thoughts about the way that whole thing plays out in this movie, because it's a movie that deals with so many Native American issues, but at the same time it does center Jeremy Renner as the white man who also has grief,
Yeah. I think I was definitely thinking a lot about that. I was gonna bring it up later, but maybe we can just get it over with here at the beginning, and then we can.
I feel like because
the actual video.
It's one of the pressing issues, I think, and just because we were talking about you said it sets the native, it sets their experience front and center, but then this is also our first. This is how we go into this world. So in that sense, it kind of makes sense to start with it, because Jeremy Renner is very much the character through which we engage with this world and this story.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if I have any personal experience which would give me any particular insight into this. I think unfortunately, this is not something that, at least, there's not a lot of education in America about kind of the ongoing situation, the ongoing what this film portrays, which is how the way the American natives were treated as as America was colonized, and then as the American Revolution happened specifically, and the American government was established, the way that all of the natives were treated during that time has repercussions that still echo forward into today. And there's still this sort of like very present injustice that has never been resolved, that continues to sort of create these conditions of, oppression and underprivilege, and creates a lot of pain. And so this movie is engaging with all of that, but there's not a lot of education about that, and Native Americans have not been given much of a voice in this country to talk about those things. And so it's really not something that you, at least in my experience, will know a lot about as an American, unless you kind of go out of your way to educate yourself to some extent on these things. So in that context, I think this movie is a really interesting one, because it's a Jeremy Renner movie. A lot of people are maybe coming over from watching him as Hawkeye or whatever, and then they're like, "Ooh, what's this Jeremy Renner Western?" And then
it has 2 Avengers actually.
It has multiple MCU characters. So if you're coming over from that, and then you land in this movie, and suddenly you're transported into maybe this world that is very real, but that you've never encountered or has never been presented to you in any kind of popular media, I think it's very positive in the way that it portrays an unrepresented story in that way. And I think that was very much Taylor Sheridan's goal and idea here, and what he was and what he was going for. And there's a lot of people who praise the movie for that specifically. There was even, I was trying to research this and get a handle on like what some of the opinions were too, also from Indigenous Americans. And
I did the same actually.
And there was some that I found that were like, "Hey, this is great." According to Taylor Sheridan, he had direct interactions with Native Americans, and
I mean, there's plenty of Native American actors in this, so they obviously had a direct input in all this. I'm guessing.
Yeah. And he tells stories of how he got involved in the communities and had people kind of ask him directly, like, "Hey, you have a voice in Hollywood. Use that voice to tell these stories." That's I saw an interview where he said that he was asked that. So I think in that context, I'm saying all of this to say, like, I think what this movie is doing within that context, and I think that is great. And there's a lot of people who are like, this is, getting this story out there in any kind of form is going to be better than it just like not existing at all. But I did see I found at least one guy who is a registered Cherokee, who actually, I live like a couple hours from a Cherokee reservation here in North Carolina, which is where they originally were, their original land before the Trail of Tears happened and they were forcibly moved to the west. But anyway, I found a post from him, who he was kind of like acknowledging that stuff, but also making more of a critique on the film. And I'll see if I can link to that in remember to link to that in the show notes. But his perspective was kind of like, good, thumbs up, but there's also room inevitably here for things to go a little bit further. And I don't want to spend too much time here. I'll wrap it up. But like, I think that would be my last question, would be like, really the main critique I would have, that I would level towards this movie, if I was going to, in this regard, would be like, why is it or like what's the significance of the protagonist being white, the guy who kind of saves the day and enacts justice being white, and does that muddy the waters a little bit? Or like the other question I would have is, even if he's white, this movie is definitely coming from like the gaze of an outsider coming into this community, instead of like putting the actual native characters as the protagonists of the story. So like, there, I guess like that would be my question, is like, why not do that? Because that seems like a great opportunity. And maybe the answer is like, well, then less white people would watch it because people want to watch Jeremy Renner be the protagonist. That's like where all these issues of like representation and telling a story, but also appealing to like an audience that a lot of times, unfortunately, doesn't care about representation, or like care about these stories. You kind of have to balance like making something that maybe people who, if you could make the version of this that's like, it's a drama that focuses on like Jeremy Renner's wife and the father and like the actual victim in the story. But then that also, to me, is probably, it's the kind of movie I would love to watch, but it's also the kind of movie that like a lot of people would never go to see. So maybe then the message doesn't get as far. Anyway, okay, I'm gonna end my big long monologue rant on this. But the short answer, or the very long answer, I guess, is it's complicated, and I don't have like a clear cut answer here. It's just like, whenever you deal with a story like this, it's complicated, and people are going to have different opinions about what the best route is. Thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this episode of Cinema of Meaning. It's the summertime and vacations are coming up, so you might be traveling around this time, and one of the things you might run into if you're traveling out of your country is not being able to access the shows you normally have access to. Last year I was traveling during the final season of Better Call Saul, and I was very excited to watch the latest episode, but when I went to watch it where I usually would, I got the very disappointing message: this content is not available in your region. This is so frustrating when it happens, but there's a solution to this: NordVPN. With NordVPN, if you're traveling in another country, you can just set your location back to your home country, and there you go, you have access to all the streaming shows you normally do. A VPN is a lot more than that, though. It's also an essential tool for keeping your online activities private and secure. NordVPN's threat protection shields you from malware trackers and ads, while the Dark Web Monitor notifies you if your credentials have been leaked online in a security attack. With NordVPN, you can stay safe and connected no matter where you are. So if you're ready to grab this very helpful internet tool, you can go to nordvpn.com/cinemaofmeaning to get our special deal on the 2-year plan, where you'll get 4 bonus months for free. I've been using NordVPN for years, and it's super easy to use. When you sign up, you'll get access to all of NordVPN's amazing features and their super fast servers, risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee. Don't miss out on this offer. Click the link in the show notes or go to nordvpn.com/cinemaofmeaning to sign up and get those 4 bonus months for free. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this episode. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, I think it's true that from the reasonable counter argument to all this is that from an inclusivity point of view, or raising marginalized voices point of view, then I think it's fair to critique like why is Jeremy Renner even there? Why not have the story be from the perspective of the dad who actually lost his daughter, and maybe he was the hunter. And but yeah, I think to that would be the very boring and economical counterclaim that, but unfortunately the world as it is, Jeremy Renner, Elizabeth Olsen, those are the kind of stars that draw more attention to a movie. At least in the perspective of a investor, I think it's still very much the convention that if you want to get a movie made, if you want to get like funding, you have to attach like a well-known or an established name to the project. And more generally, aside from money and funding, I think it's also just been a very, very ingrained storytelling trope that whenever you venture into a unknown world, at least from, the writer and director in this case is a white person, and here in
Right.
the West it's mostly white people. What to us is an unknown world. You usually do that by having some sort of uh, audience avatar
Yeah.
that they kind of latch on to, and then have them be the kind of vessel to go exploring. We see it in Avatar, which is not just a movie about blue people. It's a movie about Jake Sully going into the land of the blue people.
Right.
You see it in The Way of the Samurai, where it's not just a story about Japanese samurai. It's about Tom Cruise going to the samurai. And I think that there's some stories that have proven that this isn't necessary for an audience to enjoy something like this.
Yeah.
I think the one, I'm not sure if this is the best example, but I'm thinking of Prey, the recent one that was also, that was all native, but obviously had the Predator character as kind of the hook for that story. Maybe Shang-Chi, something like that. Black Panther, I think there's plenty of examples where a story has shown that you can portray a strange, or at least again to us, a strange, different world without having that outsider character moving into it. But then again, I think for Wind River specifically, I do think there's value in having that white perspective there, or having that white character there. Also because he's not shown to us as someone who is not a part of that community, but he is actually an insider. He's close friends with the native family. He has,
Right.
He had a native ex-wife. He knows everything there is to know about this land, and there's definitely tension there. I think that the movie addresses where it's sort of questionable to what extent he is appropriating not so much the native struggle, but more so he is kind of a little bit putting himself on equal footing, where
Right.
he talks about, especially at one scene where he talks to the son of the father who lost his daughter. They have another son, and he's kind of off the path he's doing drugs, and he's getting into all kinds of trouble. And then he gets arrested, and Jeremy speaks to him, and he's like, all we have left is this land. And then the guy's reasonably, his response is like, what's this we shit, because but at the same time, I think again, if this was just all native people and just maybe the white oil workers as like the bad guys, or the drilling guys, I think it's also as kind of silly as it is to say, it does ease the white fragility a little bit when it comes to discussing very sensitive issues like this a little bit. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but white fragility, I think, is a thing when people talk about race or
Right.
history,
Yeah.
or just in the white fragility isn't exclusive, I think, to white people, but there's people can be fragile about all sorts of things. But I think especially when it comes to American history, there's, at least in my experience, I've seen plenty of white Americans being very touchy about it.
Yeah.
And so having that Renner character there also makes that transition a little bit easier. And at the same time, I think he also kind of resembles a different kind of sentiment, where it's not just like, oh, you don't want to talk about Native American issues because you're too fragile about it, but or something like that, but also because I'm guessing, at least for a lot of Americans today, there is a genuine sense of regret, maybe, or grief, or or a genuine desire to make this right. And then I feel like his character also kind of functions as this intention to connect again, or to have him be a part in some way of their lives, and have them be a part of his life, and have there be some kind of connection or some kind of bond again that in itself doesn't resolve anything. The movie doesn't resolve a lot. At the end of it, you can argue that Jeremy does save the day to some extent, or he does deliver a small sense of justice, but at the same time, a lot of, spoilers for the end, I guess, a lot of Native American officers are dead by the end of this, and the daughters are still gone. The grief is still there, so that's none of that is resolved. So
Yeah, yeah,
but at least it does show some kind of intent that I think is interesting, and also, especially when it comes to Western storytelling, is kind of new. I think if you look at like the history of Western movies, you can see these different phases where, way back it was Native Americans were the enemies who were hunted by John Wayne or whatever, and then later there was more of a revisionism, a more grounded take, and more of a kind of white guilt-ish storytelling, maybe even. Dances with Wolves, I think, is one that is a great movie, I think. At least I think it's one that I really enjoy, but it's also one that maybe slightly romanticizes the Native Americans at the expense, specifically at the expense of white people. It's more like black and white where it comes to white people bad, Native Americans sacred and saints and whatever. And I feel like now there's more of a sort of grounding going on where both parties are equally humanized, and where now it's more about acknowledging the shared grief, and at least acknowledging that the wound is still there, and that pain is still there, and that it's not resolved by just simply romanticizing the Native Americans or by simply expressing some guilt, but it
right.
has to be I don't know, it has to be experienced in some way before it can heal, I guess.
Yeah,
And that's specifically why I love, maybe jumping ahead a little bit too far, but um, this is specifically why I love the ending to this movie so much, because it ends on that note where um, we have the father sitting in grief. He's painted on like this death face, which Jeremy points out, like, how did you know how to do that? And he's like, I don't know, I just made it up. And there's this deep sense of grief, not just for his daughter, but also you feel that loss of culture, that disconnect from his own past and his own people. But if you kind of see Jeremy Renner as the lone gunslinger in this story, I think it's fascinating that instead of having him be this character who then rides off into the sunset as he used to do, he is now a character that stays and just sits with him, because that's literally how the movie ends. The dad asks him to, do you got time to sit with me, because I just need to miss my daughter for a little bit. And Jeremy's like, yeah, I'm not going anywhere. And I think that's a very pivotal change in sentiment with regards to how these issues are approached, and that without necessarily providing an easy solution or an easy way out, it's at least, which may be a little bit outside of the reach of this movie, it at least acknowledges that there's pain here, there's grief here, and we need to sit together and just let it happen, or something along those lines.
Yeah, yeah. I think those are all very fair points, and it's I would hardly I would hardly expect any kind of white writer director going into a situation like this to make the perfect movie that's going to like perfectly convey, it's I think that's kind of an impossible task. Like the real ideal situation here is like, we should be able to have like indigenous directors and writers who can to some extent like tell the stories that they want to tell if they want to do that. And so that's something we can work towards, but I don't you can still critique this movie and like talk about what it maybe could have done better, but like I don't fault this movie necessarily for not being that, or think that it shouldn't exist because it can't be that. um so I think it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely an interesting discussion. But I think like it also does model a lot of, it's such a big leap, especially within the context of westerns. Like you're saying, it is such a step away from sort of the history that westerns have with the kind of stories they've told, and this kind of character. One of the things that I think it does really well too is kind of grounding the enemy here within like a larger context that I think is really helpful. So
Mm-hmm.
we're already in spoiler territory, but the bad guys, the predators, end up being not just one guy, but a group of white guys who are the oil drillers. And it's like, at least for me, it's kind of like hard not to see that like move as being like a gesture towards like insinuating like the problem here is bigger than just like, oh, there's some terrible men who are, you know um there's some terrible criminals who are here and they're doing
Mm-hmm.
awful stuff, into this like expression of there is a much larger problem here of like the reason those guys are even there is because this land is being exploited by these large, in this tradition of exploitation that has gone on for, hundreds of years. I think the best counter narrative that the movie has to its own sort of white savior that exists there, if you want to call it that, in
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy Renner, is like, yeah, he's like you said, he's not really saving the day. He's going in and taking out like one or two of the. He saves the white woman who's there,
Yeah.
and he takes out one or two of the bad white people who are there. But like he's not really saving the day. Like he's not really
Mm-hmm.
fixing the problem. He can't really solve any of the conditions that put this problem in place. And he's just one person in a part of this much larger system, just trying to do what little he can to, I guess, try to be an ally here. And I think that's a great narrative to put across in a film. And I think
Yeah.
like you said, the with the ending expresses something that is so necessary to some extent, which is just like not giving into sort of the apathy of that, of feeling of like, oh, I'm just this one person within this larger system that I can't fix. And so,
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing for me to do. uh I don't know. I think like
Yeah.
because the counter side of like the white savior critique is very real and legitimate, and one that needs to be discussed. But like the flip side of that coin is white people just being like, well, it's not our problem. And so I don't know. I think this movie is trying to
Yeah. Yeah.
balance that to some extent. And
Yeah, I can understand the apathy there because it does feel like a situation that genuinely does not have a solution at this point because, as the movie portrays, and I think correctly, I saw one comment from someone who actually lives in the Wind River reservation, um, who also states, like, in response to someone asking about to what extent does it accurately portray native culture, and he was like, straight up, yeah, there is no more culture there. There's uh, Wind River is kind of as it is depicted here. When we move into this place, it has like the upside down American flag. There's people living in trailers. There's nothing going on. There's no sense of prosperity or no hope for the future for the people who live there. There's no jobs, there's no direction in which a place like that is moving. And obviously, you can recognize the historical wrongs that have been done here. But at the same time, at least for me, as an outsider, I don't see an easy way this could be resolved. I think we're long past the point where Americans can be like, okay, you know what? We were wrong. We're going to pack up our bags, go back to Europe or whatever, and give this whole place back.
Europe won't take us at this point. I don't think.
I think there might be room in Australia. But
right, yeah.
But anyways, like I was thinking of, I'm from the Netherlands. My country was occupied by the Germans in, more recently than a lot of the relevant American history here played out. And, my grandparents, they lived in the area where Operation Market Garden took place at some point. So they were actually like, my historical home, quote unquote, has been the scene of gunfire and battle and that sort of stuff.
Right.
But at the same time, like, when I think about what I have inherited from that whole ordeal culturally and as well as personally, it's really nothing, or at least there's no grudge or grievance that is, at least I think by the average Dutch person, that's felt towards the Germans. And I think it's also, or at least I think the reason for that is, which may be different in the United States, is that after the Second World War, obviously, our territories were restored. Right. The Germans, they did like tons of reparations. And especially, I think, after the Cold War ended, around the 90s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. After that, Germany quickly became one of the most progressive countries in Europe. So there's a very different way in which historical mistakes were historical events.
Atrocities,
Mistake makes it sound like a whoopsie, which
yeah.
maybe is a bit too light. But there's a very different way in which that was all resolved, at least insofar as it has been quote unquote resolved. But I'm just wondering, like, or at least I was thinking about the way the United States can't really do that, and they obviously can do a lot more than they have done and
right.
are still able to do. But at the same time, there's no fundamental reparation anymore in the sense that I think for a lot of Native Americans, at least based on some of the comments I've seen, is that culture is gone. That's, they've been severed from that past. And that's also what this movie, I think, expresses in some way, where going back to the end again, where he has this face paint on and, not knowing what it means or what he's supposed to do, because he, as he says, like, there wasn't anyone to teach me how this works. So that there's a sense in that there's something fundamentally broken there, and then there's the question, what can be done about it? And that's why I guess the easy answer is apathy. But at the same time, I like that this movie, as you said, does make a case for don't do apathy, just at least take the pain, sit with the pain, and then at least pinpoint maybe some specific areas for improvement. In this case, I think this movie did a lot, or at least I'm not sure if it actually led to anything, but I think it did do a lot for me, at least, to educate on the way these jurisdictions work and the way
right.
Law enforcement works and the way crime works in these places, and also to some extent where troubles are. At the beginning of the movie, when they visit the coroner, there's this issue where the girl, Natalie, I think the victim's name, because she technically died of a lung, I'm not sure what the term was for it, but because, she ran through the snow, her lungs started bleeding and she basically drowned in her own blood. And because of that, the coroner cannot say the cause of death was murder, because, technically that's
right.
not what happened. He says, contextually, you can obviously argue that this is murder, but on the certificate, I cannot put this down. And then the FBI agent is like, well, if you cannot put this down, I cannot get like a team here. And because it has to be that it has to be a murder case, otherwise the FBI has no
Yeah.
won't do anything about it. And so there's a lot of these bureaucratic obstacles that the movie highlights I think in a very enlightening way, in the sense that you do get some idea of maybe where and how this whole thing can be improved or at least made less worse.
Yeah. 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 It does. I mean, it's not afraid to delve into some of those technical issues, which, um, kind of create problems. I mean, just the fact that they have to send out an FBI agent because the FBI is the only jurisdiction there, and all the FBI cares to send is, this inexperienced lady from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, who, like isn't fully equipped to even be in the location she's in.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of like points to the level of literal apathy that exists kind of in dealing with these issues.
Mm-hmm.
While we were talking about the cause of death, I think it's interesting to touch on kind of moving maybe away from this discussion, which I guess to put a finalizing note on. I don't know if you have any final thoughts on that, but like I would just say, we're discussing it here, and I want to see media that is handling these issues as well as they can, and I want to see people who are advocating for, telling these stories as effectively as possible, but also, I don't know the solutions. It's complicated, it's hard to solve, and it's part of a discussion, I guess, is what I'm saying, where like, I'm interested in, even like, I'm not saying I know what is the right thing here or the best way to tell a story like this or what we should be doing in the future. I can just see some of the problems and recognize some of the problems that people raise. And so I'm interested in that discussion and exploring that discussion. And part of that discussion and improving things on an ongoing basis is like people trying to make movies that do the best that they can, and then other people critiquing them, and then iterating and moving forward through time.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's just kind of part of how I see that thing.
Wait, I think I have one final note on that discussion, and then we can wrap that part up.
Yeah.
But also to kind of tie it back a little bit more to Wind River specifically, I think first off, it's not necessarily a movie's job to fix any societal issues. I think that's up to the actual society.
Right. Yeah.
It's easy to kind of, there's a tendency sometimes to really nitpick on small movie things and then neglect that it's actually, you don't have a movie problem, you have an actual problem,
Right.
But at the same time, I think where movies can help is, by educating, enlightening, showing those voices and all. But also, I think specifically here is that by including like the Renner character as this, I feel like it's a very deliberate twist on the old Western story where you have this somewhat detached gunslinger who goes into a situation that's where he has no real ties, then he fixes some kind of issue of justice usually, and then he moves on.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's value in specifically taking that myth and recontextualizing it, because I think don't hold me to this because I'm just kind of guessing here, but I'm guessing it's easier for if you want to get like a message across or inspire some kind of emotion or awareness. I think it's more difficult to tell an entirely new story than it is to take an existing myth that people already have a connection to and then sort of nudge that into a different direction or frame it in a different light. And I think that's what this movie does really well, as we already talked about, by making the lone gunslinger someone who is aggrieved himself, who knows pain, loss, and the meaning of that, and B, who is connected to the place that he operates in, and also the place that he stays in at the end. He's no longer moving away. He's now trying to make the best of what he has. He's trying to make real connections, and he's demonstrating that he's also, just as much as all the other characters, has real ties to a place that you cannot just move on from. And I think that's why I think this movie does work in the way that it's structured as it is.
Yeah. And there's something to be said for the fact that critique of that that specific trope, that character that exists in Westerns, and trying to revise it and update it and say something new with it wouldn't be the same if Renner wasn't like a white guy in a cowboy hat, doing the playing the role that he's playing. So yeah, I mean, I like this movie. I think it works within the context that it's in. I think it's just like, it's interesting to have the discussion about what it's saying and how it's saying it, and to, and to contextualize that with how the actual people being represented here feel about it, which is, there's mixed opinions. Some like it, some don't. Something that I want to get across in talking about these things is like, I think these discussions are good to have, and I think we can have them in a way that's like not a condemnation of, the media. Like, you can talk about these of the specific movie. It's like, you can talk about these things and talk about what it maybe could have done better, or how it's working or how it's not working, and even disagree about it and still be like, oh, well, we liked it as a movie. It doesn't make Tyler Sheridan like a terrible person or whatever, like there's often so much like baggage that gets attached to even discussing these things. And I think it's like, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We can, we can talk about it and have a productive conversation about it surrounding a movie and acknowledge, those parts of it, and but also not get bogged down in like whether or not that means it's like a good movie to watch that we should be supporting or something like that.
Yeah. I remember as one, like a fun anecdote, do you remember when we once met in person at the Orlando Film Festival a couple of years ago? And I'm not sure, because I stayed a couple of days longer than you did, but at one point there was a screening of a movie that had the actor who also is in Wind River as the local sheriff. Were you there for that, or was that just me?
I don't think I saw that one.
Anyways, that actor was there, Graham Greene, who plays Ben, the local sheriff of Wind River. Anyways, he was there because he played in a different movie, and he was there to promote it. And someone, like a younger member from the audience, addressed a question to him, also wanting to bring up these more social awareness issues, and kind of talk about inclusivity and sensitivity and that sort of thing, and representation. And it was a young woman, and she wasn't really getting the answer that she was hoping for, because he was like, lady, I got a payday. I've been working since I've been getting steady work in this industry since whenever, I think he's been going on for a long time, and he was fine with it all. He didn't care at all. Not to say that that's representative, but I thought it was just fun. Like, that sometimes people can project a lot of stuff on these things, and whereas an actual person might be like, yeah, I'm fine with it. But
yes. Yeah, that's the funny thing about the white savior narrative. Sometimes part of how a white savior complex plays out is white people coming in and being like, we're going to fix the situation by properly representing people in our movies that we make. And it's just like, representation can be very important, but it's also possible for these very things that you're talking about and trying to critique to play out in how you discuss these things, or how you try to quote unquote fix things with, your movie or whatever it is you're trying to do. So yeah, it's not, there's no easy like answer to this. There's no easy metric by which we can just measure a movie and then like check like, good or bad movie in regards to how it deals with representation or stories about oppressed or underprivileged people or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't even bringing it up to make like a general point. I just thought it was funny of
Yeah.
having this one person bring up all these issues and this actor being like, I don't know. I've been getting steady work for 30 years. I don't care.
We spent a lot of time on this. There are a few other things that I think might be worth discussing. One of them I wanted to talk about was sort of this movie's maybe philosophy of justice that is represented a little bit. And we see this in kind of, you talked about the fact that they can't call it the coroner can't call it a murder because she's running and what kills her is the cold air. What actually ends up killing her is the cold air in her lungs, even though not calling it a murder is ignoring the things that put in motion that death, which I think is like that's an interesting point that I think this movie is making. There's an interesting metaphor there, being like, you can look at the conditions of reservations and in the modern world, and it's possible for like the U.S. government to be like, "Whoop, technically not, technically we didn't kill him, technically not a murder," to sort of like push off this blame. But it's like, but you're ignoring sort of the common sense reality of the situation, which is, yeah, but what set in motion the things which ended up causing this tragedy, this death, and is it worth taking accountability for that? Or anyway, so there's that side of it. But then also we see this play out where Jeremy Renner's character very poetically doesn't go and shoot the guy, the rapist. He gets a confession out of him and then sets him free, and he ends up dying via the same method, which has this poetic element of like, oh, he doesn't actually murder him. He just lets him free and lets nature take its course. But there's a few conversations that happen here around this, and it very much seems like Cody kind of has this ethos or philosophy that he believes in of like, there's a justice in nature that exists despite human attempts to like do otherwise, I guess. And I was just wondering what you thought about that, if you think that's actually kind of what he believes or what this is portraying, and then if so, like how you think about that, what you think of that philosophy.
I think more generally, I think it's interesting, especially on rewatching. I rewatched the movie today, and thinking about how it presents itself as a sort of neo-Western murder mystery, but at the same time, it's not really that much of a mystery or like a murder mystery. If you compare it to like more of a detective story, there's not really any real suspects or red herrings or investigation. There's a little bit of there's some tracks in the snow, and maybe that one other guy who lives there, maybe he did it. But from the get-go, there's not many possibilities of what happened. They established like, okay, there's one house over there where these kind of drug addicts live, and there's the oil rig or the drilling facility a little bit further. So from the beginning, there's not much. It's not about the puzzle, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I think the movie is not so much about bringing you along with the mystery and puzzling it together. It's more about those contextual issues, I think, like the sense of justice that you were talking about, and the way characters deal with these more circumstantial elements and with their own inner emotions and grievances and that sort of stuff.
It feels like to me he's kind of presenting this philosophy of like, there's a justice in nature, almost like a Herzogian, like nature sort of supersedes humanity's attempts at like having this sense of morality or something.
I think there's definitely a great deal of reverence towards nature in the culture that we're presented with here in this reservation or this place. Early on, there's the snowstorm, and they kind of uh, they really talk about kind of that old-fashioned way where they're not like, oh, it's not 5 o'clock, but it's like, oh, it's there's storm about to hit, sun's about to set. It feels they're living more attuned to the elements. At least that's what it kind of feels like. Um, and in that sense, I think I'm not sure if it's so much that there's justice in nature, but at least that nature presents a force that then tests the quality and maybe also the morality of the characters that go up against it. Because there's this thing also where um, Jeremy Renner will revere Natalie, the girl who's killed, because she managed to make it so long barefooted before eventually collapsing. She at the beginning she says, or he says to the FBI agent, we cannot say for sure how far she ran, but I can promise you, however far you think she ran longer. And that's what comes back at the end, where he says to the guy who ends up being the last one, he's being set free, quote unquote. And he says to him, she ran this far. I'm betting you won't be able to make it like a tenth of that distance. And I think that's in fact what happens. So he collapses, having barely made it. He's barely out of Renner's sight,
Right.
So I think it's, in that sense, it's more of a mirror, or maybe like nature is more of a mirror or like a test of character. And so in that sense, it reflects maybe, I'm not sure if that necessarily is an issue of justice, but more of a personal character
Right.
matter, because the Elizabeth Olsen's Jane is her name in this story. She also makes it out of this, and she does. She also gets praise from Jeremy Renner's character from essentially having beaten the forces of nature, or more specifically, because she was the force of a shotgun, which she
Right.
was blown to the chest with. So yeah, I'm not sure. I as for the issue of justice, I'm not sure if there's a strong comment here. I do think there's always the interesting tension between getting justice in that more bureaucratic sense, where you would, someone has done you harm and you bring them to the authorities and they'll process this person through legislation, and this more civilized way, and that versus the kind of the old-fashioned way which we see here, where you just pick up your rifle and do it yourself, which is more crude in that sense, but it's also there's an undeniable satisfaction, especially in this movie, to the way that whole scene plays out at the end, where Jeremy Renner's just sitting at a safe distance with his rifle, and he's just blasting these guys away. I think I don't know. That scene especially is just so well executed, where it functions so well as a way to ramp up this tension, where at first you have these sheriffs, the local sheriffs from the Wind River State, or the reservation, the tension between them and these workers. And there's a great bit where the one officer thinks the other ones are flanking them, and Jane didn't see it, and he's like, ah, shit, you didn't see it. And the way that whole scene plays out with the shootout, very tragic, but also very like a great, almost like a Tarantino-esque moment, where he's talked about tension in scenes as stretching out this elastic band until it just
Right.
at one point just snaps. And that's kind of what happens here. But then just the way, Jeremy Renner comes in with this ridiculously high-powered rifle. I think especially that shot in the trailer where that one guy's just blasted against the back wall. That's just an an almost annoying sense of satisfaction to the way that plays out. Because it plays into something I think which is very primal, a more primal sense of justice, where you feel like, it's that classic eye for an eye. You hurt me,
Right.
I'm gonna hurt
Right.
you more. Um, so yeah, that's a tension that I think is here, and I'm not sure if the movie really makes a comment on it. Besides maybe landing on, well, I guess Jeremy Renner did do some good in this sense, or maybe in this case it was necessary, which might suggest, like, maybe when the whole system is messed up, maybe someone like Jeremy Renner uh, is the lesser evil in this scenario. But um, yeah, I don't think, because the movie at the end is so much, and also comes back to the sense of grief and the sense of loss that's still there. I don't feel like
Yeah.
it really lands on a strong comment in either direction, or whether or not there was a sense of justice there, because it's, no matter how you look at it, it's always going to be undercut by the grief that's still there in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's one of the best moves that the movie makes, is coming back to that point. And the tension in that scene is great. It's very suspenseful. The way he employs the flashback, I think, is really
Oh
effective.
yeah.
And I like that it like, I think I saw him being Taylor Sheridan, talking about, how he didn't want to like lean in. He wanted to stay away from the tropes of like having this long drawn out gunfight that's really cinematic. And he doesn't give us the moment where we're like looking down the scope of Jeremy Renner. So it's like, it has that gunslinging Western outlaw justice kind of effect of like, oh, you're getting to see the bad guys get blown away, but it also doesn't lean into the violence itself as a spectacle too heavily, in a way that I think like elevates his violence as like, I don't know. I just appreciate the way that I think that whole sequence was handled. I think is effective.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, when people speak highly of this movie, it's probably because of the way that final uh, act plays out. And I think one thing I'll also add to this whole this part, where um, maybe not that much related, but I also really liked, is about the fact that it's Jeremy who does all the killing, and basically does brings the justice for the dad character. Is that it does portray a sort of, they're obviously friends from the beginning. It's established they've been longtime friends. The Jane is the first on the scene uh, when she brings the news, or when she talks about Natalie, and the dad is kind of aloof. But then when Jeremy visits, he instantly breaks. So there's such a
Yeah.
great establishing there of their connection, and also in the way that he almost, not necessarily orders him, but he kind of assumes Jeremy Renner is gonna bring some kind of justice, or he's gonna send him out on a sort of, on this quest, not explicitly, but more like with this wink. And Jeremy, he instantly understands it. He was already on it. And I like that sort of, maybe it's just me, I always have a soft spot for stuff like this, but these kind of unspoken covenants between men, or between people, between friends, which I really like, and which also comes back in the end, where the dad asks for this subtle affirmation that the last guy did in fact not get away, and Jeremy's
Right.
like, yeah, he didn't. And I don't know, I like there's a quiet connection there between them, where there's so much that goes unspoken, but at the same time there's a lot that's being said about the way these people have each other's back, which I think, which I'm guessing is also a form of justice in a place where the institutions do not adequately provide it, where there's at least some sort of justice in the community itself, in between the actual people that live there. And I don't know, I thought that was just really nice. Well, that's it for this episode of Cinema of Meaning. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last month we've talked about the Netflix show Beef, but before that we've also covered Fight Club, Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Drive, and many, many others. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes, and we'll see you again next time.